The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, the federal body responsible for ensuring the United States has functioning electricity, issued a forecast stating that U.S. power demand in summer will rise 224 gigawatts over the next decade. That is roughly the equivalent of adding 180 million homes to the grid. Bloomberg reported that one energy analyst said the last comparable demand surge came during World War II. And NERC's Director of Reliability Assessment, John Moura, a man who has been doing this job for close to 30 years, said this is probably one of the grimmest pictures they have ever painted. His exact words were, simply put, our infrastructure is not being built fast enough to keep up with the rising demand. And that assessment was made before the Iran war drove natural gas prices through the ceiling, before the Strait of Hormuz closure disrupted 20% of global energy supply, before electricity prices rose 37% from 2020 to an average of 18 cents per kilowatt-hour nationally, with some regions already above 30 cents, before data centers consumed so much power that electricity costs in communities near large data center developments rose by as much as 267% compared to 2020 levels, according to a Morgan Stanley Wealth Management report published this year. And before the summer heat that is now weeks away arrives to push air conditioning demand to levels that the grid was not designed to handle and does not have the generation capacity to meet. The United States of America, the nation that electrified the world, the nation that built the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam, and the largest transmission network in human history, is heading into a summer where its own grid regulator is publicly warning that hundreds of millions of Americans are at risk of blackouts, not because of a hurricane, not because of a cyber attack, because the demand for electricity is growing faster than the infrastructure to deliver it. The power plants that used to meet peak demand are being retired faster than they are being replaced, and the war in the Middle East has destabilized the fuel markets that the remaining plants depend on. America will go dark this summer. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in enough places for enough people, for long enough, that the consequences will be felt in hospitals, in nursing homes, in homes where elderly Americans depend on air conditioning not for comfort but for survival, in freezers full of medication that requires refrigeration, and in the economic productivity of every business that cannot operate without reliable power, and almost nobody is ready for it. The grid was built in the mid-20th century, and it is operating beyond its intended lifespan in almost every region. Much of America's electrical grid was built between the 1950s and the 1970s. The poles, the transformers, the substations, the transmission lines that carry electricity from where it is generated to where it is consumed were designed with a lifespan of 40 to 60 years. That means the infrastructure that was built in 1960 has now been operating for 66 years. The infrastructure built in 1970 has been operating for 56 years. These are machines and structures that were engineered for a world where electricity demand was a fraction of what it is today, where the climate was measurably cooler, where data centers did not exist, where electric vehicles did not exist, where homes were not filled with dozens of electronic devices drawing power continuously, and where the peak demand events that stress the grid to its limits were less frequent and less extreme than what the grid now experiences annually. Solar Reviews documented that utilities are investing heavily in upgrades to the distribution system, the local network that delivers power to homes and businesses, because these systems are under strain from higher demand, more extreme weather, and modern reliability standards. But the investments are not keeping pace. Utility Dive reported that NERC has recognized confirmed generator retirements of 52 gigawatts by 2029 and 78 gigawatts over the 10-year assessment period. However, when you include generators that have announced retirements but not yet begun formal deactivation, the total expected retirements climb to 115 gigawatts by 2034. That is 115 gigawatts of generation capacity being removed from the grid over the next decade. To put that number in perspective, 115 gigawatts is approximately 10% of total U.S. generating capacity, and the replacements, primarily wind and solar installations, do not generate power continuously. They generate power when the wind blows and the sun shines. On a 105-degree July afternoon when the sun is setting, solar output is dropping, wind is often calm, and every air conditioner in a city of 5 million people is running at maximum, the grid needs dispatchable power. Dispatchable power comes from natural gas plants, coal plants, and nuclear plants. The natural gas plants need fuel. The coal plants are being retired. And the nuclear plants that could provide reliable baseload are being decommissioned rather than re-licensed because the economics of nuclear power in a deregulated market do not work without government support that has been inconsistent for decades. NERC warned that resource additions are not keeping up with generator retirements and demand growth, and that PJM Interconnection, the grid operator for 13 states plus the District of Columbia serving 65 million people from New Jersey to Illinois, faces elevated risks beginning in 2026. Specifically, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, serving 15 states that straddle the Mississippi River, faces a high risk of energy shortfalls that will intensify through 2028 to 2031. And in Texas, ERCOT, the grid that operates independently from the rest of the country, faces resource adequacy concerns as the share of dispatchable resources in the mix struggles to keep pace with surging load growth. And the interconnection between these regional grids is itself a vulnerability. The American grid is not one grid. It is three: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and ERCOT in Texas. When one region experiences a shortfall, it can import power from neighboring regions through transmission ties. But those ties have limited capacity. And when a heat wave covers multiple regions simultaneously, which is exactly what happens during a heat dome event like the one that struck the western United States in 2021, every region needs more power at the same time, and there is no surplus anywhere to import. NERC specifically warned that wide-area heat events can expose multiple assessment areas to simultaneous risk of energy supply shortfalls, because each area relies on regional transfers to meet peak demand. And in the evening hours when solar PV output drops rapidly, the grid enters what California grid operators call the duck curve period, where demand remains high but solar generation plummets, and the remaining dispatchable plants must ramp up within minutes to fill a gap of tens of gigawatts. If those plants are unavailable, if they have been retired, or if their fuel supply is constrained by the same natural gas market tightness that the Iran war has created, the lights go out. Not in theory, in practice. California experienced rolling blackouts in August 2020 during a heat wave for exactly this reason. The grid ran out of power at sunset when solar dropped off faster than gas plants could ramp up. And the grid in 2026 has more solar, fewer dispatchable plants, higher demand, and tighter fuel supply than it did in 2020. Every variable has moved in the wrong direction. Data centers are consuming the grid like a parasite, and ordinary Americans are paying the bill. The artificial intelligence boom has created an electricity demand crisis that would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. Data centers, the massive computing facilities that power AI, cloud storage, cryptocurrency mining, and the digital infrastructure of the modern economy, are consuming electricity at a rate that is rewriting every demand forecast the energy industry has ever made. NERC's 10-year summer peak demand forecast has grown by more than 50% within the last year alone. That is not a gradual trend. That is a step change in demand that the grid was not designed for and cannot accommodate without massive new investment that has not been made and will take years to complete, even if the money and permits were available tomorrow. Stanley Wealth Management reported that data centers and generative AI are forecast to account for 75% of incremental load growth through 2030. Fortune reported that electricity costs in communities near large data center developments have risen by as much as 267% compared to 2020 levels. A Union of Concerned Scientists analysis found that utilities in 7 PJM states passed billions of dollars in transmission upgrade costs to connect data centers, and those costs are spread across all customers, including residential households who never asked for a data center in their community and receive no benefit from its operation. The electricity demand from AI data centers has surged by 13% in just the past year. Chatham House analysis found that data center growth could drive up electricity prices as much as 25% for some U.S. markets by 2030. And the Trump administration's Ratepayer Protection Pledge, which was framed as a historic commitment to keep electricity costs down by getting tech companies to pay for their own energy, is voluntary, non-binding, and relies on self-negotiated agreements between tech companies and utilities with no federal oversight. Chatham House assessed that under prevailing utility regulation and explicit exemptions for data centers, the burden of transmission upgrades and elevated demand will still likely fall on consumers. The tech companies get the computing power, the AI companies get the revenue, and the 72-year-old retiree in rural Virginia who has never used artificial intelligence in her life gets a utility bill that has doubled because the grid in her area was upgraded to serve a data center campus that was built on the farmland behind her house. That is not a hypothetical. That is the documented experience of communities across Virginia, Texas, Georgia, Ohio, and the Carolinas, where data center construction has exploded over the past 3 years. The United States now hosts approximately 45% of the world's data centers, according to Fortune. Nearly half of the global computing infrastructure is plugged into the American grid, and the American consumer is subsidizing the electricity for all of it through higher rates on their monthly bill. And the demand is not slowing, it is accelerating. The EIA expects demand from the commercial and industrial sectors to grow U.S. electricity consumption by 1% in 2026 and 3% in 2027, marking the first 4 years of consecutive growth since 2005 to 2007, and the strongest 4-year period of growth since the turn of the century. After 2 decades of essentially flat electricity demand, the grid is suddenly being asked to grow at a pace it has not experienced since the era when every American household was acquiring its first air conditioner and its first television simultaneously. And the growth is concentrated in the wrong places. Data centers cluster in areas with cheap land, favorable tax treatment, and existing transmission capacity. Those areas are often the same areas where residential customers have benefited from low electricity rates for decades. When a 100-megawatt data center plugs into a rural utility grid that was designed for 50 megawatts of peak residential load, the transmission and distribution infrastructure has to be rebuilt at a cost that is ultimately recovered from every customer on that utility's network. The residents of Loudoun County, Virginia, which hosts more data center capacity than any other county in the world, have watched their utility infrastructure expand exponentially while their residential rates have climbed year after year. Loudoun County is not an outlier, it is a preview. Every rural electric cooperative and small municipal utility that is being approached by data center developers is facing the same dynamic. The developer offers jobs and tax revenue, the utility builds the infrastructure, the ratepayers fund the construction. And when the summer heat arrives, and the data center's cooling systems draw megawatts of power continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the residential customers discover that there is no spare capacity left for their air conditioning at 4 p.m. on a July afternoon because the data center is consuming it. The Iran war has destabilized the fuel supply for every natural gas power plant in America, and the timing is catastrophic. Natural gas-fired power plants generate approximately 43% of U.S. electricity. They are the backbone of the American grid. They are the plants that ramp up when demand spikes on a July afternoon. They are the plants that provide the dispatchable power that keeps the lights on when solar drops off at sunset and wind dies down in the heat. And every one of those plants depends on a continuous supply of affordable natural gas. Chatham House documented that U.S. natural gas demand is rising due to increasing LNG exports, which are forecast to be up 50% by 2027 compared to 2024. LNG exports were the fastest-growing use of natural gas in 2025, comprising 14.1% of total U.S. gas consumption, more than the residential or commercial sectors. That export growth tightens the domestic market because every cubic foot of gas that is liquefied and shipped to Europe or Asia is a cubic foot that is not available to fuel an American power plant. And the Iran war has amplified this pressure catastrophically. The Strait of Hormuz closure disrupted not only 20% of global oil supply, but also a significant portion of global LNG trade. Qatar, which is one of the world's largest LNG exporters, had its export facilities targeted by drone attacks. The disruption to global LNG supply has forced European and Asian buyers to bid aggressively for American LNG cargoes, pulling more U.S. natural gas into the export market at the exact moment American power plants need it most. The EIA projects wholesale power costs at $51 per megawatt-hour in 2026, up from $47 in 2025 and $38 in 2024. That 34% increase in wholesale power costs over 2 years will be passed directly to residential customers through their monthly utility bills. And in Texas, which is ground zero for both data center construction and grid stress, wholesale market prices at one major hub are projected to increase by 45% in 2026. EcoFlow analysis showed that electricity sales will rise 9.2% in Texas and surrounding states, 3 times the national average of 2.6% growth. Texas is simultaneously adding data centers that consume massive amounts of power and losing the natural gas supply stability that its power plants depend on. And ERCOT, the Texas grid operator, has already asked residents to voluntarily curb electricity use during heat waves in previous years, when power plants unexpectedly shut down. The 2021 winter storm that froze natural gas wellheads and pipelines brought the Texas grid within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a total collapse that would have taken months to restore. That near catastrophe happened in winter when demand was spiking for heating. The summer version of that stress test is approaching, and the grid has more demand, more data centers, higher fuel costs, and the same structural vulnerabilities that nearly caused the collapse in 2021. And here is the dimension that no one in the energy industry is saying publicly, but that the data makes unmistakable. The war in Iran has not just raised natural gas prices, it has introduced a volatility premium into natural gas futures that forces power plant operators to hedge their fuel purchases at higher costs, which are passed to ratepayers. It has created shipping route disruptions that affect LNG cargo delivery schedules, which creates inventory uncertainty at receiving terminals, which forces utilities to keep backup fuel contracts at premium prices. It has destabilized the global energy insurance market, which raises the cost of insuring every pipeline, every tanker, every terminal, and every storage facility in the natural gas supply chain. Those costs are not temporary. They will persist for years after the war ends, because the insurance market reprices risk based on demonstrated events, and the Strait of Hormuz closure is now a demonstrated event. The risk premium on Middle East energy infrastructure will be elevated for a decade, and that premium will be embedded in the electricity rate that every American household pays every month for the next 10 years. Chatham House's analysis specifically concluded that the OBABA's cancellation of clean energy tax incentives could lead to households paying an additional $165 annually by 2030 and $280 by 2035. That is on top of the $1.4 trillion in grid investment being recovered from ratepayers, on top of the Iran war risk premium, on top of the data center demand surge, on top of the 37% increase that has already occurred since 2020. Your electric bill has already risen 37% since 2020, and it is about to get worse, and there is no relief coming. The U.S. Energy Information Administration puts the national average residential price per kilowatt-hour in 2026 at 18 cents, up approximately 37% from 2020. That is not a temporary spike. That is a structural repricing of what it costs to keep the lights on in America. Utility Dive reported the assessment of industry experts in a headline that should have been front-page news across the country. Customers, don't expect electric bill relief in 2026. The cake is baked. The average American household consumes 855 kilowatt-hours per month. In 2020, that translated to roughly $1,400 per year on electricity. With projected annual increases of 4 to 5%, that same household could be paying over $2,000 by 2028. And those are national averages that obscure enormous regional variation. States like Massachusetts, California, and Hawaii already pay some of the highest rates in the nation, over 30 cents per kilowatt-hour. Low-income families face the heaviest burden, already spending more than 15% of their income on energy. A 4.2% rate increase forces impossible choices between paying the electric bill or covering other essentials. And the drivers of the increase are not going away. They are compounding. Grid upgrades that utilities are spending $1.4 trillion on from 2025 to 2030 will be recovered from ratepayers over decades through regulated rates. Producer Price Index figures from November showed that copper wire and cable costs as well as switchgear costs were all up more than 11% year over year and approximately 60% from 2020. Tariffs, inflation, and supply chain issues have also impacted key components like aluminum, transformers, and turbines. And FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been slow to address the regulatory gap in how transmission projects get approved and put on bills. One industry expert told Utility Dive that the cost to consumers of transmission investment in the last 5 years, when FERC incentives and financing charges are factored in, amounts to almost $1.8 trillion. And consumers are on the hook. The cake is baked. The phrase "the cake is baked" was used by an industry insider quoted in Utility Dive's January 2026 analysis, and it means that the price increases appearing on your bill today were locked in by decisions and investments made years ago that are now being recovered through your rates. And the decisions being made right now, the data center connections, the grid hardening for extreme weather, the transformer replacements, the transmission line upgrades, will appear on your bill in 2027, 2028, and 2029. The bill goes up, it does not come back down, because the investments that drove it up are permanent infrastructure that is amortized over 20 to 40 years. You will be paying for the data center transmission line that was built this year for the next 3 decades, even if the data center closes tomorrow. And the political dimension of this crisis is unlike any energy debate in modern American history. Bloomberg reported that voters across the country are angry about rising energy costs, making power politics an unusual force in midterm elections for the first time ever. The energy bill is now the new inflation indicator. It arrives every month. It is higher than last month, and unlike the grocery bill, which the consumer can partially manage by switching brands and buying less, the electricity bill is determined by a rate structure that the consumer has no ability to influence. You pay what the utility charges. You have no alternative provider in most markets. You have no ability to negotiate, and you have no ability to generate your own power unless you can afford a solar installation and battery system that costs $25,000 to $40,000 up front, which most American households cannot. The electricity market is the last true monopoly in American consumer life. And the monopoly is raising prices at a rate that exceeds wage growth, exceeds inflation, and exceeds the capacity of the average household budget to absorb. The Urban Institute documented that residential electricity costs have increased faster than earnings across much of the country, leaving customers paying about $40 more per month in December 2025 than they paid in December 2017. That $40 per month is $480 per year in additional electricity costs alone. And for the low-income households that are already spending more than 15% of their income on energy, that $480 is the difference between keeping the lights on and receiving a disconnection notice. The number of Americans disconnected from electricity for non-payment has been climbing steadily since 2022, and the summer of 2026 will test whether that trend becomes a crisis in itself, as households that cannot afford their bills are cut off from the grid at the exact moment when the temperature makes electricity a matter of life and death. When the power goes out in a heat wave, the death toll starts in hours, not days, and nobody has a plan for it. NERC's projections indicate that between 2024 and 2028, an alarming 300 million people across the United States could face power outages. The Federation of American Scientists published an analysis warning that the prospect of widespread summer blackouts looms large amid the nation's unpreparedness for such scenarios. And the public health dimension of a blackout during extreme heat is the most underestimated risk in American domestic policy. A heatwave blackout is not an inconvenience. It is a medical emergency that begins killing people within hours. In a city like Phoenix, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 115 degrees, air conditioning is life support. One researcher described it explicitly. In a city like Phoenix, air conditioning is life support for people, and if you have a disruption, that's a tremendous vulnerability. When the power goes out in a heat wave, the interior temperature of a home begins rising immediately. Within 2 hours, an unventilated home in 110-degree heat reaches interior temperatures above 100 degrees. Within 4 hours, the temperature becomes dangerous for elderly individuals, infants, and anyone with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions. Within 8 hours, healthy adults begin experiencing heat exhaustion. Within 12 hours, the risk of heat stroke, organ failure, and death becomes significant for vulnerable populations. And the people most vulnerable to heat-related death are disproportionately the people least able to evacuate or find alternative cooling. Elderly Americans living alone, low-income Americans without cars, disabled Americans who cannot physically relocate, rural Americans who are miles from the nearest cooling center, if one exists at all. Since 2015, national power outages have surged by over 150% due to demand and extreme weather, amplified by climate change. Last year, U.S. residents lost more power than any year in the previous decade, with the annual average of 11 hours of electricity interruptions nearly double the annual average of the last 10 years. And when a blackout occurs, the cascading failures extend far beyond the electricity itself. Telecommunications go down. Cell towers have battery backup that lasts 4 to 8 hours. After that, cell service fails. Traffic signals go dark. Water pumping stations lose power, reducing or eliminating water pressure. Gas stations cannot pump fuel because the pumps run on electricity. ATMs and point-of-sale systems go offline, making cash the only functional currency. Refrigerated food begins spoiling within 4 hours. Medications that require refrigeration, including insulin, certain biologics, and vaccines, become unsafe. Hospital backup generators have fuel for 24 to 72 hours depending on the facility. If the blackout extends beyond that window, hospitals face the prospect of evacuating patients while the roads are gridlocked. The traffic lights are dark, and the communication systems are degraded. The Federation of American Scientists specifically called for a mandate requiring an executive order or interagency memorandum for public health and emergency response planning for widespread grid failure under extreme heat. That mandate does not exist. There is no federal plan for managing a multi-state blackout during a heat wave. There is no framework to prioritize regions for power restoration. There are no protocols specifically designed to safeguard critical medical services during a grid failure event. The plan, such as it is that utilities will implement rolling blackouts to manage the load. But rolling blackouts are managed power reductions that assume the grid is functional enough to be managed. If the grid experiences a cascading failure, Where the loss of one segment overloads adjacent segments, rolling blackouts become uncontrolled blackouts that can spread across interconnection boundaries and affect tens of millions of people simultaneously. The transformer shortage is the hidden crisis that guarantees recovery from any blackout will take weeks or months, not hours. NERC has warned repeatedly about the shortage of large power transformers, the massive, custom-manufactured devices that step voltage up and down as electricity moves from generation to transmission to distribution. These transformers are the most critical and least replaceable component of the entire grid. A large power transformer costs between $3 million and $10 million. It takes 12 to 24 months to manufacture. It weighs between 100 and 400 tons. It cannot be transported by normal truck. It requires specialized heavy-haul trailers, rail cars, or barges. And there are no American manufacturers producing them at scale. The majority of large power transformers used in the United States are imported from South Korea, Germany, and China. NERC documented that many utilities have relatively low inventories of replacement transformers, and that recovery times following hurricanes or severe storms could be slowed by low inventories of replacement distribution transformers. Supply chain constraints have led to maintenance delays and have slowed some new resource additions. The shortage means that if a major transformer fails during a summer blackout, whether from overload, overheating, or a surge, the replacement may not arrive for 12 to 18 months. The area served by that transformer would be without full power for that entire period. NERC, which regulates the transmission grid, has identified that the loss of only 9 critical high-voltage transformers out of approximately 2,000 in the U.S. could result in a coast-to-coast blackout lasting 18 months or more. 9 transformers out of 2,000. A failure rate of less than 0.5% could cascade into a blackout that covers the continental United States for a year and a half. That scenario is the extreme tail risk. But the localized version of it, where 1 or 2 critical transformers fail in a regional grid during a heat wave, is not a tail risk. It is a recurring reality. And the lead times for replacement ensure that any failure becomes a prolonged outage that cannot be resolved by sending a repair crew. It can only be resolved by manufacturing, shipping, and installing a device that takes a year to build and weighs as much as a commercial aircraft. The supply chain for transformers has been further stressed by tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, by the same supply chain disruptions that have affected every other industrial sector since the pandemic, and by the competition for manufacturing capacity from countries around the world that are simultaneously trying to upgrade their own aging grids. The American grid is operating on a transformer inventory that NERC itself has described as low, in a market where replacements take over a year, in a summer where demand will test the equipment to its limits. And no American household is thinking about transformers. Nobody knows what a transformer is. Nobody knows that the device humming on the utility pole outside their house is a custom-manufactured component that takes a year to replace if it fails. But if it fails on a 108-degree July afternoon, everything downstream of it goes dark. And it stays dark until a replacement arrives from a factory in Seoul or Stuttgart. And the wildfire dimension adds yet another layer of compound risk. NERC has specifically flagged the risk of a heavy wildfire season in the western United States during summer months. Wildfires threaten transmission lines directly. When a power line goes down because of a fire, localized areas can lose power for extended periods, from half a neighborhood to half a state depending on the lines affected. And smoke from wildfires reduces the output of solar panels, which means the renewable generation that the grid is increasingly depending on to meet peak demand produces less power during the exact events that also damage the transmission infrastructure needed to deliver whatever power it does produce. California's wildfire mitigation efforts alone cost ratepayers $27 billion between 2019 and the present. Those costs include the burial of transmission lines underground in high fire risk areas, the installation of weather monitoring stations along transmission corridors, the deployment of sectionalizing switches that can isolate damaged segments, and the insurance premiums that utilities pay to cover the catastrophic liability they face if their equipment starts a fire. Every dollar of those mitigation costs is recovered from residential customers through rate increases. The ratepayer in Los Angeles is paying for wildfire hardening in the Sierra Nevada mountains because the same utility serves both areas and the regulatory framework allows the costs to be spread across the entire customer base. And the combination of wildfire risk, heat wave demand, solar panel smoke reduction, and infrastructure aging creates a summer risk profile in the western United States that is, in NERC's own assessment, at elevated risk of energy shortfalls in any above normal temperature scenario. And above normal temperatures are no longer the exception. They are the baseline. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has reported that most recent summers have been the hottest on record. The probability of an extreme heat event in July and August of 2026 is not a tail risk. It is the modal outcome. Electricity bills are already the new inflation indicator in American politics. Bloomberg reported that voters across the country are angry about rising energy costs, making power politics an unusual force in the midterm elections for the first time in the modern era. Democrats who focused on household energy costs swept key elections in New Jersey, Virginia, and Georgia in 2025, signaling that electricity affordability has become a decisive voting issue. And the pressure will intensify through the summer as air conditioning demand peaks, war-driven natural gas prices cascade through utility rates, and the first rolling blackouts or conservation pleas from grid operators generate the kind of headlines that no political messaging can overcome. The electricity crisis is different from every other affordability issue in one fundamental respect. You can switch to cheaper groceries, you can downgrade your car insurance, you can cancel a streaming subscription. You cannot choose to use less air conditioning when the temperature is 108 degrees and you are 74 years old, and your doctor has told you that heat exposure could trigger a cardiac event. The electricity is not optional, the price is not negotiable, and the supply is not guaranteed. Share this video with every American you know who pays an electric bill. Because the summer of 2026 is approaching at a speed that the grid infrastructure, the fuel supply, the transformer inventory, and the political system cannot match. And the people who understand what is coming will be the people who fill their prescriptions early, charge their devices daily, know where their nearest cooling center is, have a plan for their medications if the power goes out, and have had the conversation with their elderly parents and neighbors about what to do when the lights go off and the cell tower batteries die and the air conditioning stops and nobody is coming for 4 to 8 hours or longer. That conversation is more important than anything else in this video. Have it today, because the summer does not wait for anyone to be ready, and America is not ready for this. Not the federal government, which has no plan for a multi-state heatwave blackout. Not the state governments, which are still waiting for federal guidance on grid hardening standards that have not been issued. Not the utilities, which are running equipment beyond its design lifespan with low transformer inventories and rising fuel costs. Not the grid operators, who have been warning for 30 years that this moment was coming and have watched as every level of government treated their warnings as background noise. And not the American household, which will discover the fragility of the system it depends on for survival at the worst possible moment, on the hottest day of the year, when the air conditioning stops and nobody answers the phone because the cell towers are down and the only information available is whatever was printed in yesterday's newspaper. If you still get one, that is what going dark looks like. That is what is coming this summer, and nobody who could have prevented it chose to prevent it. They chose to add 180 million homes worth of data center demand to a grid that was already operating beyond its limits, in a country that is fighting a war that has destabilized the fuel supply it depends on, during the hottest decade in recorded human history. And then they told you the lights would stay on.